two phases of elevated oxygen consumption. We have this phase here, which I'm going to kind of shade in this pink colour, and we have a second shade, which I'm going to do in a light blue. We have a second stage of oxygen consumption, which is this stage here. So I'm just shading this kind of little blue colour. Having these training units build into our microcycle, which each of those build into our mesocycle, which each of those build into our macrocycle, and the outcome, then of course we have more opportunity to work towards that target and that specific outcome that the athlete wants to achieve. The only other point I would make is about targets again. What we tend to find, let's take the preparation phase mesocycle, we tend to find that this is going to be based on fitness testing targets. How would we illustrate this? Well, what we do is we'd say is that as the lowering happens, we get this shape under the curve. This is what we'd refer to. We just shade it in for you. Let me shade it in nice light blue. This is what we would call here negative impulse. Okay, negative impulse. Right, negative impulse. Now, of course, as we now start accelerating upwards, we now get a positive curve like this. And of course, this half here, this part here is what, of course, we've already looked at, which is called positive impulse. So we can have this type of shape because this negative impulse is what we call that preparation phase, lowering, and this positive impulse is the actual upwards phase, the jumping phase. But in the middle of this, I'll depict this in kind of like a thick orange, we have a thick protein filament, which I want you to begin to refer to as myosin. And this myosin is sitting in the middle of these sarcomeres. So look, notice that the proteins are much thicker compared to the actin the actin. But you've noticed as well that as we're depicting them right now, there is no connection between the myosin and the actin. All we can say is that the myosin is the thick protein filament and the actin is the thin protein filament. But this is where I'm going to maybe do this one a little bit longer actually. But this is where it gets a little bit exciting. I personally think it gets a little bit exciting. You might think it's the dullest thing on earth, but in my opinion, it's kind of exciting. Key points I'd like to stress to you on this topic area. We're saying basically that the process of thermoregulation, which we're going to explain how it operates in a minute, is about keeping the body temperature at 37 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. We don't want to distort too much from that area, and we're incredibly efficient at it. The team, these collection of individuals, they begin to stabilize and they develop what we refer to as conventions, typical behaviors and systems which keep people in their place. And we're also saying there tends to be in this stage a focus on goals. Okay, so there tends to be a focus on goals. And basically speaking, let's put this over here, we tend to find there's greater levels of cohesion by this stage. And finally, we have greater levels of up arrow cooperation. Those are both up arrow cohesion and up arrow cooperation in this norming stage. Like a person gives up easily, so they're not persistent if we're going to describe it in the negative frame. We're tending to find that they have low efficacy, so that is state-specific confidence, again from that kind of Bandura self-efficacy model that you might have studied elsewhere. There are some negatives, and I'm going to put negatives in sort of a dull red so it shows it better. First of all, it's what we'd call self-assessment. Sounds like my tax relationship, but self-assessment, what this means is that the person is reporting about themselves. So of course they have to, it's hard to be completely honest about your own views and values and behaviors, right? There's an issue there. We tend to find as a result of that, we sometimes get what are called demand characteristics. This means that individuals are more likely to answer a questionnaire in a way that's sort of seen as socially desirable, acceptable or normal, even if they don't hold that view, because they don't want to be seen as some kind of oddity or deviant of some kind. So any of those sort of ideas and behaviours would tend to be hidden within these environments because people don't want to report themselves on it. Thirdly, we've got issues therefore of validity. If people are not always honest, then we have to question, is this actually a valid report? And finally, we've got this is a really interesting one, question interpretation. It's really interesting how people write questionnaire questions, because how you write them can very much lead people in one direction or another. These two theories together, what do we end up with? We end up with this interactionist perspective, and there have been some really interesting ideas around this. So first of all, let us realise that the interactionist perspective, if we're ever going to describe this in an answer, we are going to say it's trait theory combined with social learning theory. Okay, so we would write that in our answers. Okay, we're saying that both theories have some relevance, but neither alone can explain nor predict how an individual is likely to behave in a particular situation. Okay, so we need facets of both. Let me just drag it down a little further. So look, we've got two primary theories I'd like to talk to you about here. The cognitive side of anxiety. How can we control negative thoughts and this kind of thing? Well, first of all, I'm going to talk to you about imagery. Okay, when we talk about imagery, I'm going to talk to you about different types. First of all, we've got one which is called personal imagery. This is where you imagine yourself, often in the sporting situation, being effective within your performance, and you visualize that experience. We've got another one which is called kinesthetic imagery. This is the process of not only visualizing the successful performance and movements, but you also actually twitch the muscles which are going to be operating when you do that. We also get notions of middle-class influence. Now, by the second half of the century, we get what we call middle-class codification. So games such as association football were literally coded into the form that we know association football today. That was done by the middle-class football in 1863 in Cambridge, for example. Sporting excellence, what are we looking at as a concept here? We're saying that in some way people progress from a concept of participation, often when they're young, often when they're in school, often when they're at the first club experience, to an experience of performance in sport. This is normally competitive, it is normally technical, it is normally coaching based, and that some people progress into an experience of excellence. Now, I guess we've got the situation where there's a lot of people coming in at this level, and I think we say the more the better. A number of people make it to this level too, but then very few people make this transition. So I guess the question we're asking is, how do we get more people involved? How do we get more people moving from the participation to the performance level? And how do we get more people to this excellence point? So at least philosophically and at least conceptually, that's how we'd like you to think about this. So the first, sometimes these people receive sponsorship. Okay, sponsorship. So sometimes athletes are sponsored. They weren't professional, they weren't paid. Sometimes they receive sponsorship. Now, can you sort of link that to today and think about something like the Talented Athlete Scholarship Scheme, for example, where we've got amateur athletes, young athletes, but they receive a little bit of sponsorship, a little bit of income to help them out. There is the commercialisation. That's positives.